a new density paradigm. I'm not going to define this paradigm in very concrete terms because that's not appropriate. What I'm going to do is actually draw on the experience had recently for the city of Richmond Hill, a suburban community just outside of Toronto that recognized that while folks loved the neighborhoods they lived in, that there were a series of sort of strip centers and commercial corridors, et cetera, that needed redevelopment, which could be redeveloped on a very different model, a model that celebrated walkable density and thereby enhanced the quality of life and, frankly, degree of economic opportunity for all of Richmond Hill by attracting the folks it would attract and the jobs and investment it would attract. To do this, we had to think of density not as a fixed quality in its own right, but as a tool that needed to be shaped and wielded according to the task at hand. So, for example, walkability to support retail, transit, enhanced public realm are different. They start, however, roughly with a sort of a threshold level of 30 to 40 units per acre. That's illustrated in the examples, which will provide enough retail, enough folks to bring a block of Main Street to life within 5 minutes, and is the bottom threshold for attracting bus rapid transit. Light rail and heavy rail probably require greater densities, probably twice those densities. And for these kinds of transit modes, we need to begin to think about neighborhoods with clusters of mid-rise and high-rise buildings, but within 5 minutes of a transit stop. So as we are looking at these higher densities, it's important to remember that we're talking about not recreating the great neighborhoods folks already live in. For instance, in Richmond Hill, there are a lot of folks who love their houses and love their single-family houses and their front yards and backyards and local neighborhood parks. They didn't want a blade of grass touched on any of their front lawns, but they wanted places to walk to. They didn't want to have to commute into downtown Toronto for jobs. They wanted a stronger tax base. They also recognized that markets were changing, and in order to preserve demand for their single-family houses, when a majority of the market was interested in mixed-use walkable environments, they needed places that folks could walk to within 5 minutes from their neighborhoods. It is very important to put markets to work to achieve the right walkable density for a task. When we talk about markets, we're really talking about housing. I think that's probably obvious from what I've said. Office markets are going to be very quiet, to be polite, but we have very robust housing markets, as discussed earlier. We are planning for downtown El Paso and the neighborhoods surrounding downtown. In order to inject new life, vitality, jobs, bring an innovation economy to life for El Paso, and thereby expand economic opportunity across El Paso and the region. We are targeting this housing market. I should say downtown has attracted very little housing up to this point. It's mostly gone out to suburban subdivisions. Markets are requiring a new look at that, but more importantly, planning for the future, a future for El Paso that benefits all El Pasoans, particularly with an innovation economy, but also a greater variety of housing. El Paso has a large immigrant population and is growing in that way, and a lot of these folks are younger, but even El Paso, like the rest of North America, is aging, and on top of all the other arguments I've made here, the need for new housing options. For example, this is a strip center of Mesa Street, a major north-south corridor in El Paso, next to the University of Texas at El Paso, that now has a market driven by housing to reshape about 20 or 30 acres of surface parking lots and strip retail, et cetera, which is been in decline, and I should say a lot of bars. Students and also soldiers from Fort Bliss love to gather at, into a mixed-use, walkable neighborhood center that, frankly, can still have those bars and a lot more restaurants, a central square or park, housing options for folks who live in the neighborhoods to the east, and students who who use the campus to the west to come and live in together to create a really economically, socially, racially, culturally diverse neighborhood. But more than anything else, create a new center for community life for the northern edges of the communities that surround downtown. Going back to Memphis, which I've mentioned a couple of times, Memphis has downtown includes a number of sort of suburban, low-density areas. In fact, it's really just the light blue toned core on the diagram to the right that would look like a traditional downtown to most people. In order to really bring the kind of life and vitality to downtown Memphis, the core of downtown, and the neighborhoods considered downtown neighborhoods, even though many of them are larger single family, it was really critical to take advantage. And Memphis is a slow growth region, so there's not a lot of population growth. But to understand that the demographic churn in the markets was producing significant new demand for thousands of higher density, multifamily housing units located in mixed use, walkable concentrations, meaning that the core of planning strategy used to shape the plan for downtown Memphis's future for the next 10 or 20 years was to encourage this housing and concentrate it all within 5 minutes of Main Street, that sort of red line with 2 arrowheads that you see in the center of the diagram, and other existing or emerging sort of mixed-use retail, but sort of walkable, vibrant nodes in downtown. Because if we spread the housing out, it pays no dividends in terms of enhanced life on the street and vitality. Life on the street and vitality that not only enhance the quality of life for those living nearby, but also attract the talent that attracts jobs and investment. So it became absolutely critical for our client, the Downtown Memphis Commission, which was the Downtown Partnership, and controlled development incentives, to make sure that it only provided these incentives for new housing that was proposed within a 5-minute walk of places it really wanted to either bring to life or make still more lively. It's also important to really employ strategies that take advantage of and help unlock the feasibility of walkable density. So, for example, in downtown El Paso, we are able to talk about adding several thousand new housing units with almost no new parking. Parking built for office buildings downtown is now much emptier than it has been and will be for years to come, thanks to hybrid work. So by sharing that parking, writing a memorandum of understanding between the owner of that parking and the developer of the housing that makes those spaces available to the housing, both benefit. There's some financial transaction involved, but this is far less expensive than building new structured parking for this downtown housing, and therefore the shift to hybrid work is creating an opportunity to subsidize the next generation of downtown housing. It's also really important to look at opportunities to make this next generation development greener, because as we focus on attracting housing from remote suburbs to downtown cores and inner neighborhoods, we have opportunities to share energy and waste and take other steps that not only reduce cost, but enhance environmental responsibility. What's the process to get here? I think everybody knows that density is a term, how should I say it? You know what? Density is about as popular as the other D word these days. And we and our communities need to change this approach. And I will say, after spending sometimes 3 to 6 months in conversation with folks in neighborhoods, both urban and suburban, about denser development nearby, not in the midst of their existing residential neighborhoods, but nearby. I've had folks raise their hand and say, we want to make sure we have enough density to deliver the amenity that will enhance our quality of life, as opposed to, we don't want that density in the first place. We've got to get folks to say, what do they need in their neighborhoods, and then help them understand how we can achieve this in ways that don't disrupt their neighborhoods. And this starts with leadership. This is Eva Galambos, the mayor of the most conservative community I've ever worked in, very affluent, largely affluent, I should say, actually economically diverse, but Sandy Springs, Georgia. And she basically led her community in a conversation to transform a series of strip shopping centers and failing malls in the center of Sandy Springs, a newly formed suburban community in Fulton County, just outside Atlanta, into a lively, mixed-use, walkable downtown because she wanted a heart for her community. In order to get that heart, though, we needed to have an awful lot of these meetings. We needed folks to understand the demographics that were reshaping housing markets, the economic trends that were essential to understand if Sandy Springs was going to continue to build its commercial tax base, meaning attracting not traditional office users, but the kind of innovation industries that needed local talent living nearby, and to really understand that the future needed to look very different in downtown, but that new future downtown enabled them to really enrich and reinforce the quality of life that they had originally come to Sandy Springs for in their beautiful residential neighborhoods. And I want to tell you the process was successful. It was also successful in Dublin, Ohio, where we had to talk about very similar issues. And I think I mentioned earlier, Dublin is, I know I did, one of the most affluent communities in the Midwest, suburbs in the Midwest. Folks quickly came to understand that this pattern, freestanding office buildings and a sea of surface parking that could even reflect that parking, was not the future. The future was a new suburban downtown for Dublin that could be the heart of that community. All of this takes partnerships by public-private partnerships, and by that I mean public investment. Very rarely does significant new, denser, mixed-use, walkable development pay for itself initially. It pays very rich dividends over the intermediate, not just long-term. I would say Dublin invested probably about $300 million of public money to replace this with a downtown mixed-use walkable bridge park, which then unlocked about $3 billion of private investment. But my good colleague, Brett Roller, who is the planning director for the Downtown Memphis Commission, put together this analysis for his board when we were talking about the importance of incentives to encourage a new round of development, higher density mixed-use walkable development in downtown Memphis and nearby, which basically said that a payment in lieu of taxes, that's a pilot, which in effect is an agreement to reduce or forego real estate taxes as a subsidy for a project that might amount to $1 million over a 10 or 15 year period, would produce, when the pilot in other words, you would forgive taxes, let's say for 10 or 15 years. You might forgive 100% of real estate taxes, or the tax increment over what the lower value development you're redeveloping had produced, 0 for 10 years. It might rise over the next 5 years to 100%, et cetera. But basically, for the pilots that Memphis had recently approved, the cost in lost taxes would be about $1 million a year, $970,000 a year. When those pilots expired in 10 or more years, the return would be more than $4 million a year to Memphis. Public-private partnerships are invariably particularly in housing density, walkable density, are a very good investment.